Hi, it's Amy. So let's see if I even remember how to do this, how to sit in front of a camera and film here, because it's been a while. But I thought I would pop in today to my channel and talk about my experiences buying books online over the past decade and some of the tips I would have if you're just starting out buying used books online. Because it seems like a fairly simple thing to do. You know, you find your used book and you purchase it and it shows up at your door the same way that a new book would off of Amazon. But it's really not so simple. There's so many things to consider when you're purchasing a used book. You know, I started out 12 years ago uh, buying books off of Amazon. That was the first way that I was purchasing books online. And of course, in those days, those were new books because I didn't yet realize just the extent of what was available to buy online. You know, I was 19, 20 years old with my very first credit card. My experience with book buying had been, you know, thrift stores and secondhand bookstores, buying books in person where you see the physical book. You can see exactly its condition and any things that might be wrong with it. And it's not the same when you're buying a used book online. And I think a lot of people, when they're looking for a used book, they'll look at the listings that are on Amazon, which, yes, there are some legitimately good postings on Amazon, but for the most part, on sites like Amazon, you're going to find sellers by the names of, you know, Thrift Books, Book Outlet, Better World Books, which I guess is fine if you're not too particular about the edition or the condition of the book. My experience with sites like Thrift Books or Better World Books is that what shows up may not necessarily be what you've ordered. You're going to get a book and it may be in the condition described, but it may not be the edition you thought you were buying. And I've had this experience ordering books for my mom. She really enjoys a lot of the vintage Christian romances. And she doesn't do online book shopping herself, but she'll send me a link to something on Amazon. Often it'll be thrift books. And on one or two occasions, she was hoping to get, you know, a specific original edition to match the other ones on her shelf. And what showed up was a completely different edition than what we thought we were purchasing, which is fine. If you're just a casual reader and you're just looking for an edition of the title that you want and you don't care what it looks like, then sites like Thrift Books and Better World Books are for you. But if you're sort of going beyond just reading, and if you're building a collection like the collection that I built behind me, you're going to want to be a little bit more particular about the books that you're buying. So myself, when I'm looking for a book, I will often go on a site called Abe. Now I call it Abe because that seems to be the pronunciation, but it's ABE Books. It started off as a Canadian site way back in the 90s, but it was purchased by Amazon. But basically what it is an American book marketplace. And what you're going to find on there are shops or storefronts the same way you would on, I suppose, eBay or Etsy, from independent booksellers across the world. Some of them are going to be, you know, established brick and mortar, used in antiquarian bookshops, and some of them are going to be, you know, bookshops in name only, where it's an individual who is perhaps selling out of their home, or perhaps, you know, they've got all their books in a storage locker somewhere and that's how they're operating their business. And both of those are fine. Both of those you can get great books from. But you do need to pay attention to a number of things if you're shopping on Abe or on eBay. Sometimes I purchase from eBay as well. And you can even find books on sites like Etsy, although on Etsy people tend to be selling them more as pieces of home decor as opposed to a book. And on Etsy, I think you'll find they're going to be much more expensive for what you're getting than if you find them elsewhere. But when you're searching for an online book to purchase, the number one thing you want to make sure is that there is a seller supplied image. In most cases, you're going to have greater success in getting a good quality book and the book that you want if there is a seller supplied image. And on eBay, you don't really have the option, I think, to search for an image or not. On eBay, there will be images with every posting, but it could be a blank image. It could be a stock image. It could be an image of a past version of the book that is sold and not the physical book you are buying. So you really have to read the posting, read the description of the images, and make sure that what you're looking at is indeed the book that you're buying. On Abe, it's a little easier because you can tailor your search preferences to only show you books with seller supplied images. Because in some cases, and you do still have to be careful if there's a seller supplied image, in some cases, a bookseller is not going to take the time to take pictures of all their books. They may leave that section blank, in which case you don't really know what you're buying because you physically can't see it. Or they may use a stock image taken by another bookseller. And usually if it's a stock image, you're going to be able to tell because you're going to see a whole bunch of postings when you're searching for this book with the same exact image, same book, same copy, same angle, and you're going to know that what you're seeing is not the book that you're actually purchasing. Now, in some cases, if there is no seller supplied image and you still think the posting looks good, you can usually contact the bookseller and ask for images. And I had a great experience earlier this week when I was looking for a particular copy of a book in a particular binding. And I wanted to know from the seller whether the book that they had listed was the red cloth or the blue cloth, because there are two editions from the same exact year, same publication info. And so I reached out, and this was a great seller. They responded within a couple of hours. And not only did they answer my question, but they sent me some pictures of the book that had not initially been on the listing. Now, unfortunately, it was the red cloth, and I was looking for the blue cloth. But I thanked them for their time, and I went on my way to search for other listings. And so whether or not there is a seller supplied image is going to tell you a lot about the particular book, and is going to inform your decision as to whether you want to buy that particular copy. Another thing you want to look out for is print on demand. Services like Amazon and even on Abe are going to have sellers in their marketplace who are selling you nothing but print on demand books. And there may be a seller supplied image, there may not be, but usually if you pay attention and you read the full description, you'll see somewhere in there that says print on demand, or in some cases the publication date is going to clue you in that this is not an original edition of the book that you're trying to buy. If the publication date for a book published in 1894 says 2024, then you can pretty much guarantee that what that seller is going to do is the moment you press order and your payment goes through, they are going to have some factory somewhere. In some cases, it seems to be India, some factory in India, or some, amateur style bookbinder in India is going to print off a facsimile copy of the book you want to buy. And that facsimile may show up to you crooked. It may show up in, quote, leather bound. There's a number of these print on demand services that promise you a leather bound version of the book. And what you're going to get in, I'd say 90% of cases, is not going to be a quality book. It's going to be a photocopied facsimile that may or may not be crooked on the page. You may be missing some pages of the work. It may be blurry because the photocopies weren't good. And if it's leather bound, there could be glue residue. It's going to be cheap leather. The gold lettering on your spine may or may not be well done. In my own collecting, I've only purchased one or two of these print-on-demand books. And that was because I simply couldn't find the book anywhere else for a price that I could afford. And in both cases, in all cases, the books were very, very poor quality. And I eventually ended up removing them from my collection because they were just so bad. In one instance, it was a title by Agnes Repplier, the 19th century American essayist that I love so much. And I wanted one of her titles, which was only available at that point in time in very expensive editions online. And so I decided to opt for a cheaper print-on-demand version, and it was just very, very poor quality. And so I eventually replaced that with a cheaper used edition that was not really in great condition, but it was a much better book to be adding to my collection compared to the print-on-demand one. So you want to look out for seller-supplied images and whether the book is print-on-demand. Then you also want to pay attention to the condition that it's listed as. On used book postings online, you're going to see sort of categories. You might see fine, very good, or good. And I would say in most cases, those books are perfectly fine to buy. You're going to get a decent looking book. If a book is listed as fine, that usually means that it's going to be like new. There's probably nothing wrong with it. The spine is not going to be, bumped anywhere. It's not going to have any chips on the dust jacket. There's not going to be any library marks or writing in it. If it's very good, you might have a few small things wrong with it. It's not going to quite be like new, but it's going to be pretty damn good looking. And if it's just good, it's going to be a nice copy, but you might have some annotations in there. There could be, a past owner's book plate. You might be missing the dust jacket. If you see a book listed as poor, acceptable, or fair, in most cases, you're probably going to want to avoid that book altogether, because that means that book is really not in great condition. And especially if you see phrasing in the description, such as, unhinged, heavily soiled, or, detached spine, stuff like that, you're going to be getting a book that is most likely dirty and or falling apart. So unless you are absolutely desperate to add a copy of that book to your collection, avoid those postings that say, fair, poor, or acceptable. And in most cases, if there's a seller-supplied image, you're going to be able to see exactly what is wrong with it. But in some cases, the seller is going to take the pictures in such a way that you're not going to see just how badly the book is falling apart. In some cases, you might not see just how dirty it is, depending on what lighting they've chosen to take the pictures in. So you do have to be careful, and you do have to pay attention to all aspects of the listing. And it can be tricky because in some cases, the bookseller is just going to copy and paste from somewhere on the internet some other description, or if it's what I would call a warehouse bookseller, something like Thrift Books or some of those warehouse ones. And you'll recognize the warehouse booksellers because when your book shows up, it's going to probably be in a plastic bag or maybe a very cheap cardboard box where you're just going to pull the strip, and it's not going to be well packed at all. In fact, your book may be damaged, depending on what it is. It may be damaged in the mail on the way to you, just because it's not properly packed. A good bookseller is going to pack your book in probably a cardboard box or cardboard of some kind, and then you're going to see a layer of bubble wrap or a layer of tissue paper or just something in there that's going to protect your book and keep it nice and tight so it's not shaking in the package as it comes to you. And if a book is well packed, it's going to arrive to you in the same condition that it shipped from the bookseller. But back to my original point. Some of these booksellers, they copy and paste book descriptions. And so what you're seeing in the description of the listing has nothing to do with that particular book or the particular copy they're selling. It's the same one that, 7 other booksellers have copy and pasted, or it's the same description that is in every single posting for every single book they're selling that is listed as good. And so you'll see things like, may have some writing, may be a library discard, may be this, may be that. And you'll see that it's identical in every single posting. And so in that case, you're kind of taking a risk. You don't know what you're getting. You may get a book that has library stickers and library pockets in it. You may get a book that has a little bit of highlighting, or the book that shows up may be in excellent condition with none of that on there. But as I said, a good bookseller is going to write their own description for each of the books, and they're going to tell you exactly the points and any issues with the exact copy that you're purchasing. And so I'm just going to look at my notebook here because I wanted to make sure I was going to hit on all the points I was thinking of earlier. So yes, we've covered that. Another thing you can do is explore the website of the bookseller. Often on used book marketplaces, the sellers are going to cross-list their listings across multiple sites. You might see the same bookseller on Abe and on Amazon and on eBay. It'll be the same exact book, same exact price. And in that case, it's usually a clue that that is an established bookseller that's going to have their own website. And sometimes there's even a link to their website on the posting. If not, you can usually find them through a quick search engine, Google, and you can explore their website and see whether they are a reputable bookseller and whether they're someone that you're going to want to take the risk of buying a book from. Now, if you're buying a relatively cheap book, the risk is relatively low. If things go wrong and the book shows up and it's not what you thought you wanted and you're having trouble with the bookseller, in most cases, if it's, a relatively cheap book, you don't have to feel too badly because you're only going to be out, a few dollars. But if you're making a more expensive purchase, say you see one of your dream books for your collection online and it's listed at $100 plus shipping, you might want to take a closer look at exactly who is selling this book to you. And so go and check out their website if it exists. Look at their listings, look at the history on there, look at where they're located, look at customer reviews if there's any, and get to know that bookseller a bit and then make your decision as to whether that is the copy of the book you want to take the risk of purchasing. In most cases, there are going to be, complaint processes, ways to request your money back, but in all instances, it may not go in your favor. I've had instances where I was buying books online, and this seemed to be an issue that, happened back in 2020 when things with shipping internationally were a bit chaotic, because there was a period of time where I ordered a couple of books that when coming into the country, if they had gone through the usual process from, the United States Postal Service through customs onto Canada Post, there shouldn't have been any fees on those books. But in that instance, the booksellers ended up using a third-party courier service that I wasn't aware of and I really haven't heard of since. But that third-party courier service chose to utilize a collect on delivery service through Canada Post. And when the book arrived, I ended up having to pay $12 additional to get the book from Canada Post, because fees that the courier had needed to pay to Canada Post were offset on to me, which I could have made a real deal out of it, because I think that's actually illegal to just send something by collect on delivery without discussing it with the customer first, and it would have been well within my right to refuse that delivery. But in one instance, the bookseller did refund me that $12, saying, "We're so sorry, we didn't realize this was going to happen." And in another instance, the bookseller just said, like, "No, like that's a you problem. As per the terms of service, customs and duties are, they're up to you to pay." And, I responded back with him, "These aren't customs and duties. If you had sent these, by Canada, by the US Postal Service and by Canada Post, there would have been no customs or duties on this book. But because you chose to use this third-party service, there were extra fees, and I still don't quite understand it. But it hasn't happened since, and whatever that third-party courier service was seems to be out of business and to have disappeared from the internet. So who knows what that was. But on that topic, shipping fees. Depending on where you live, for instance, if you live in Canada, be very, very wary of shipping fees that seem incredibly cheap or incredibly low. If you look at a shipping fee and think, "Goodness, there's no possible way that seller could ship that book from their country to mine with the fees that Canada Post puts out for the price they're putting there," be aware that 8 or 9 times out of 10, once you place that order, that seller is probably going to come back to you and request additional charges, realizing that they've made a mistake. In many cases, it's because the seller is inexperienced with shipping internationally, or in my case, they're inexperienced with shipping to Canada. Often they'll say to me, "Goodness, I've never shipped a book to Canada before. I didn't realize it would be this expensive. I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to request additional charges, additional fees, or otherwise cancel this order." And in most cases, I am perfectly okay with that because I've anticipated it ahead of time. If I see a book and, it's a heavy hardcover, or even a book of any kind, really, and they've listed the shipping as like, "Oh yes, the book, $21 with $3.99 shipping," and then I do that exchange rate and it comes out to a little bit more, about 25% more. So I'm like, yeah, there's no way they're shipping this book to me for $3.99. Now I'd say 1 or every 2 times out of 10, the seller just decides to eat the cost, and you do get it for that incredibly cheap shipping price. But most of the time, they are going to reach out and request additional charges. So if you are in a country where the cost of shipping things is high and you see that low shipping price, calculate that into your total cost of the book, what you think it's going to be, because often, $3.99 is going to turn into $15, $20, sometimes even $25, depending on the weight and the size of the book, for me at least. Calculate that into your total cost and factor that into your decision making as to whether you want to click purchase on that book. So what else do I have here in my notebook? Measurements. Pay attention to the measurements of the book. I've said several times in this video so far that when you're purchasing a book that's used, you really want to read every last bit of that description. And in most cases, if the book is not, your typical sized book that we would see nowadays, the seller is going to include the dimensions, because there are very tiny books and there are very large books, and you really don't want to be surprised. The size of the book may factor into your decision to buy it. It's not only, whether it's going to fit onto your shelves. Honestly, I don't care whether a book is going to fit onto my shelves or not. If it's too large for the shelf, I make it work. It's going on the top, or it's going sideways, or it's going somewhere else altogether. But it's when the books are smaller and listed for a high price that you may be a little bit disappointed when it shows up. Early in my book collecting journey, And this was only about 5 years ago now, because oddly enough, I've been reading my whole life. I've been buying books my whole life, but it was really only about, I would say, 7 or 8 years ago that I started to think of myself as a book collector and to really build a collection that I could be proud of on my shelves, that I, enjoy, that I started to curate it. It's really only the last 7 or 8 years that I've considered myself not only a reader, but a book collector. But early in my book collecting journey, I purchased a beautifully bound book by J.M. Barrie, and the seller supplied images were taken in such a way that it looked to me like a fairly large book. It looked to me as though it were, if not, an average size book, slightly larger. And so I was expecting, a nice big book. And what I got in the mail was just slightly larger than the size of my palm. It really was a pocketbook in every sense of the word. And although it was a really beautiful book, and it's still in my collection, beautifully bound, it was a little bit disappointing to realize that through my own fault, I hadn't paid enough of attention to really think about what these measurements were. Now, in my defense, I'm Canadian, so I operate in the metric system. And this was an American listing, and the measurements were in inches. But I was smart enough, if I had really paid attention, to be able to figure it out that this was a fairly small book and it was not the size I was thinking, and that I was about to spend a fairly large amount of money for my budget at the time on a book that was small. Now, in some instances, you may be looking for a small book. You may not care. In my collecting now, I really wouldn't care about the size of the book as long as I knew that it was a small book I was ordering, and that's what I was intending to order. But at this point in time, it was disappointing just to see this tiny book show up when what I had collected so far of J.M. Barrie was fairly large volumes. So you do have to pay attention to those measurements. And I guess I would say the final thing, if you are buying used books online, do not be surprised if your postal carrier gets to know you by name, and if you become known to him as the book lady. My Canada Post guy has frequently said to me, "Oh, hi Amy, I got some more books for you. Oh, looks like there's some books today." And it is kind of fun and nice to know your postal carrier. But just be aware, if you start buying used books online, you may no longer just be another anonymous customer. You may be known by your local postal carrier. So I guess those are my tips for buying used books online, and I'm sure there's many other things I could talk about if I had given this, additional thought. These were just the thoughts that I put together this morning as I was watching another video here on BookTube where someone was talking about how they built their collection, and I thought, that's interesting. Their collection was new books. My collection is old books, and I think I've gathered a useful amount of knowledge over the past almost a decade that I've been buying used books online. And I've discovered that many people just don't know. Many people don't know where to go. Many people don't know what to look for. And people assume that if I'm buying, especially non-readers, non-book collectors, people who read new books, they assume that if I'm buying used books, I'm doing it in person. Or that anything I'm buying online is going to be new books. And obviously that is not the case. Many of us here on YouTube buy exclusively used books, and many of us have built this body of knowledge. So I would say, if you have any additional tips for buying used books online, please put them in the comments below so that everyone here who stumbles across this video, all of us, can make use of these tips. And I guess I will end the video here for now. And it's an overcast Sunday, but I'm here in my library, and I would say that it's great to be back here on BookTube.